As the PowerPoint says, we're going to be talking about the 70 AD doctrine. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine just this past week, and we were talking about this class. We were talking about what we've been studying in pre- and post-millennialism. And the topic of 70 AD came up. He made a comment I thought was pretty, is very possible, the situation. He said that the realized eschatology, it's the name of what we're studying, 70 AD doctrine, realized eschatology might be a response to premillennialism that has taken a step too far. Their greatest problem is they look at Scripture and can't help but read Jerusalem and the temple into every passage. I felt like that summarized pretty well what we're going to see in class today. That you have premillennialism that looks and says that there is this future kingdom that is coming and all of these events in the Bible that are yet to be fulfilled but will be fulfilled in the future. We see the opposite of that in 70 AD. What we'll notice is pretty much everything in the Bible, not pretty much, all things in the Bible have been fulfilled. That's going to be a key component to this. I think, Terry, you asked an excellent question last time I was teaching, and that was, how do we tell the difference between figurative and literal? I think this class is going to help us see that. Examples of people who have taken things that are literal and made them figurative and vice versa. But we're going to see it kind of like at a caricature level. You know, you go get a caricature made and they'll pick either a flaw or a part of your personality that they're going to really make emphasized. That's kind of what we're going to see in this class, is that there's a lot of things in 70 AD doctrine that is emphasized almost to a cartoonish level. It's really, when you dig into it, a hard doctrine to not look at and go, how do people believe this? How is this so popular? But it is popular, and it is growing, and there are people, even here in Kentucky, this is something we'll see in a moment, that it didn't originate here, but it is spreading out from where it originated, and it has been adopted by many. One last thing before we jump in, and is I have my notebook up here and I have my pen, and if you have questions and I don't have answers, I will write them down, and I'll give them to John, and maybe on Wednesday when he gets back, I think he should be back Wednesday, he can cover those then and give you some better answers. All right, what I hope to accomplish in this class is to show that this doctrine, which I'm going to just refer to as RE because I'll get tongue-tied if I keep trying to say realized eschatology all day long. This doctrine is completely undermined by the Bible, by Scripture. We can look at the Bible and very easily see that this is false, but because of that, and in light of that, we also need to understand that it's led many away from the faith. It's led many away from the church. But hopefully by the end of the class, we'll be able to know not only what the Bible says about it and how that compares to what they believe and what they hold to be true, but also how we might be able to help them see that and be able to examine through Scripture together to maybe see their error. So, what is the 70 AD doctrine? What does it hold? This first slide, I'm realizing I probably didn't put any animations in here at all, so I'm going to have all the text on the screen the whole class. So, number one, they hold something that I think we probably agree on. And I wanted to start with this to say that we're talking about people who have a desire to study the Bible. And they will study the Bible with you. It's not something that says, well, no, I know what I believe and I don't have to look. They are all about trying to get other people to see as they see. And so you don't have a hard time getting them to study with you. In fact, what you typically get is a hard time from them if you don't want to study with them. That has been my experience, that if you won't sit down and study this with me, then you're just afraid that I have the truth and you don't, and that just emboldens me to say I'm right and you're wrong. So this first point, all Old Testament apocalyptic language defines New Testament apocalyptic language. They're going to say, when you see the sun and the moon was darkened, or the moon turned to blood, when you see that sort of language, stars falling from the sky, you can't interpret that unless you know what it meant. by going back to the Old Testament and seeing the first time it was used. I think we would agree very much on that. Whenever Jesus uses that language in Matthew 24, he's using the language that the prophets also used to bring about an understanding of what he was about to do. When John gets to the Matthew 24 class, that will become even more vivid, but that's something that we agree on. That we need to let Old Testament prophecy that is used in the New Testament, we need to let the Old Testament definition kind of lead us to what the guys that are using it, when Paul says these things, when Jesus says these things, what did they mean? What's the backdrop? What's the context of that? We have to be able to see that. But here's where things start to kind of really take a hard left turn. All biblical prophecy was fulfilled in 70 A.D. Everything, what would we call that? We have talked about how we would typically be described as amillennial or amillennial. Those who say the kingdom is yet to be fulfilled might be pre- or post-millennial. What would this view be? Preterism. And as me and Miss Carol were talking earlier, we have different views of preterism. We have partial preterism that say some of the Bible has been fulfilled. We might fall into that camp on certain levels. We would say some of these things in the Scripture have been fulfilled, but not all of them. Full preterism will say all of the Bible has been fulfilled, and yet there are full preterists who will look to this doctrine and say, I don't believe that. And so really you have almost another category that comes up when you start getting into the RE doctrine, and that is a hyper full preterism. The point is, it's hard to just kind of lump them in with other people that have similar views, because there are things that they believe that really stand out. For example, this all biblical prophecy being fulfilled means that in the destruction of Jerusalem, the second coming of Christ occurred. This would be a key thing that they believe. The destruction of Jerusalem, Jesus spiritually came back. Now, when we say that, you might be tempted to go, well, I believe that. Because we do, to a certain extent. We do believe that there was a coming of judgment on the nation of Israel. And Jesus talked about the Son of Man coming with power, and he talked about things that would happen in the generation of people that he was speaking with. But when they read this, they're going to say that occurred, and that's the last time that it's going to occur. This was the second coming that the angels talked about whenever Jesus went back into heaven in Acts chapter 1. This is, this is the judgment that Paul talks about in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. This is the culmination of all things that the Bible has been talking about. So what they believe is the kingdom was not established in 33 A.D., but was established in 70 A.D. at the destruction of Jerusalem. They believe that the resurrection of the dead occurred in 70 A.D. at the destruction of Jerusalem. They believe that the end of the world occurred in 70 A.D. at the destruction of Jerusalem, and they believe final judgment occurred at this time as well. And you might look at that, think about that list of things and go, that makes no sense. But the way that they have taken Scripture and have twisted it and have manipulated it to fit this paradigm, this narrative that they are trying to put forward, as I said, it has become very influential, and it is growing, and there are countless people. I have family members. There was a small church here in Kentucky that this was taught, and the result of this class being taught was a church that borderline split, but a large percentage of the people adopted this doctrine. There's some things that we need to consider when we consider the implication of the things they believe. Christ is never again going to return. It's already happened. It's done. There will never be a future universal judgment. Whenever a person dies, judgment occurs individually at that moment. There will never be a universal bodily resurrection, and this physical universe will never be destroyed. These are the teachings of the 70 AD doctrine. realized eschatology. These are the things that they bring forward when they say all things have come to completion in 70 AD. To get to that, we have to really change some things. In fact, the implications, if we have time at the end of class, the implications of the 70 AD doctrine are wide and very, very complete in our understanding of what that means about Scripture, what that means about the way the church is functioning today, what the church even is today. This doctrine changes fundamentally everything that we have understood. So, how did we get here? That's what we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about. How did we get to this point? So, a very brief history. I'm sure that there's a lot more that you can learn about how we got here. There is a guy in the 1400s. He is a friar, Franciscan friar. He kind of is sometimes considered the father of this. Really, he didn't father this movement, but he kind of planted some seeds that led to some of the guys that we're going to look at here now. C.H. Dodd, in 1935, he wrote, and really is probably the father of realized eschatology, under that sense. He wrote this book called The Parables of the Kingdom, and in it he really started laying the groundwork for this idea that in 70 A.D. everything had come to completion. The kingdom had been established, and all of the prophecies of the Bible were fulfilled. But it's Max King who really kind of set the stage for what we see today. Now, he didn't call it realized eschatology. He called it covenant eschatology. Covenant eschatology. Max King is a Church of Christ preacher, and he wrote this book, The Spirit of Prophecy, and in it he really lays out, it's kind of become the Bible of people who hold this view. We are going to interpret God's Word through the views of this operating manual, if you will. Yes. So it is found elsewhere. C.H. Dodd was not a Church of Christ. He was, I forget now what he was. I don't think I wrote it down. He was a liberal theologian. That's what he so I'm not sure what denomination he was connected to. Here's the thing. Max King was member of the church. I think they would probably be a more institutional church. But a lot of the people who followed Max found that they didn't find acceptance of their doctrine within the church. And so it is spread to the denominational world because they couldn't keep preaching it here. Couldn't keep preaching it within the church, so they moved outside of that to find people who would accept this. Now, their idea in saying that, if you were to ask some of them, do you still find this teaching in the church? They would say yes. They would say yes because we are not teaching the truth, and we are not the church because of that. We are futurists. Now, if you remember, we've already talked about that term futurist. How is that primarily, anybody remember how that's primarily been used in the past when you think of, especially when you think of eschatological studies? What is futurism? So think premillennialism. Futurism is the prophecies of Revelation have yet to be fulfilled. They will be fulfilled in the future. They have taken that term and reappropriated it to say, oh, you all are futurists, not because you think Revelation will be fulfilled in the future. You say it's already been fulfilled, but you think it was going to be fulfilled after 70 AD, so you're a futurist. They're really good at that. And we'll see, I think, examples of that, of taking terms and going, I'm going to make this mean what I want it to mean. And I'm going to give new definitions to words. A phrase called pigeonholing. We're going to take terms and ideas and we're going to lock them in to this one meaning, and it can never mean anything but that meaning, because if it ever changes, it affects our doctrine. And so we've got to stand really strong on that. We'll see very, very real examples of that. And then the other thing is this idea of spiritualizing. Now, we would probably say they are taking literal terms and making them figurative. But if you're talking with someone that holds this, they're not going to say that. They're going to say, well, it's a spiritual event. It's something that's spiritually happening. What they mean by that is Jesus was using figurative language. Paul was using figurative language. He didn't mean these things were literally going to happen, but they were figuratively going to happen, and that occurred at this time and is now done. So that kind of gets it. Something to consider. Isaiah chapter 5. Whenever somebody tells you, I've got this belief, but for you to understand it, you just got to trust my definitions. We're going to have to change the definitions of things. We're going to have to kind of lock them, lock them into this new definition that we have. Something to consider. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. It should be a red flag when someone says, I have this new doctrine. For you to understand it, we have to redefine everything that we know about these terms, about the Bible. You need to understand things the way that I understand them. You need to understand these words the way that I understand them. It doesn't mean that it's wrong right off the bat. But it should be a red flag to say, I need to pay very close attention to what they're saying and really consider the implications of this, the impact that it might have. So a couple examples of how they have done this with their vocabulary. If you want to look over to Matthew chapter 16, verse 28, or Mark chapter 9, verse 1, either of those are going to be, they're the same event that is going on. And whoever gets to either one of those passages first and wants to just read that, go ahead and do that. Matthew, let's get my page here, hold on. There we go. Matthew chapter 16, verse 28, or Mark 9, 1. All right, so that phrase, they're going to look at that and say, the Son of Man coming in His kingdom, Christ's going to return, people in this generation are going to experience that. Now, if you just listen to Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 says, when the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. Suddenly there came from heaven a noise like a violent rushing wind. It filled the whole house where they were sitting, and there appeared to them tongues of fire, distributing themselves, and they rested on each one of them, and they were all filled with the Holy Spirit, and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit was giving them utterances. And when commenting on this very event, Peter responds in verse 33 saying, therefore, having been exalted to the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, He has poured forth this which you both see and hear. To the very people that Jesus was talking to in His day, when He said, you're going to see the Son of Man coming with power and the Spirit, these things occurring in Acts chapter 2, Peter says, you are seeing it. You are hearing it right now, the things that Jesus was talking about. But they'll take those passages and say, no, the Son of Man coming in Matthew 16, 28 has to be the exact same thing as what He says in Matthew 24. Matthew 24, verses 29 through 34. Let's look at those together. Again, we're going to get into Matthew 24 in more detail. But in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And He will send forth His angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together His elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, again, our first slide, they look at that language and they go, that's Old Testament prophetic language, which is something we should all do. Recognize that those words have been used before. Those words are talking about the fall of a nation, the fall of a power, that God is bringing it to an end. And it's very rightful that they look at Matthew 24 and go, hey, that's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what Jesus was talking about. He was talking about the temple. He'd been asked questions about the temple, and He was answering them. But they're going to take that language and go, you see, that's language talking about the return of the Son of Man. Matthew chapter 16 is talking about the coming of the Son of Man. They have to be the same thing. We're going to force them into the same box and say they must both be talking about the same event. They must both be talking about 70 A.D. Another place they'll do that with is John 14. John 14 is talking about a coming of Jesus. So in John 14, do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. Now, they're going to look at this passage and go, look, we see language that indicates the coming of Jesus. We saw it in Matthew 16. We saw it in Matthew 24. We saw it in John 14. Those are all the same thing because they're all talking about the same thing, a coming of Jesus. And we begin to see how they take their vocabulary and force everything through the same filter. Everything has to be the same thing when this word is used. We'll see other examples of that as well. But we're going to just continually say, if this word or if this is an event that's talking about, and here specifically, Christ's return or Christ's coming in some way, it's always the same. It always is talking about the same event. We already saw that Matthew 16 is vividly fulfilled in Acts 2. Matthew 24 is definitely talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Those are two very different events that he's talking about there, and they're going to say, no, they can't be talking about two different events. They must be the same. John 14, we would say, is a third event that is he's talking about. That's not going to happen in Acts 2. That's not going to happen in 70 A.D. Aaron?
I was just going to say, when you look at the parallel accounts in Mark and Luke, they use different language. They don't use coming than what Matthew 16 uses. So they have to ignore the parallels with these accounts in order to use Matthew 16.
And there's a lot more examples of that as well. We're not going to get into this. We're just going to look at a few things that I think are major. But the law, they believe the law was not nailed to the cross, as Colossians 2 talks about, that the law continued on until the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. And when we read these last days, like in the Hebrew 1, they're talking about that's a transitional period. And it ended in 70 A.D. It doesn't continue to today. That ended in 70 A.D. with the destruction of the temple and the ending of the law. And so to do that, they ignore passages. Hebrews 8 being a major one. We're not going to use that because Hebrews 8 specifically talks about the old covenant ending so that the new covenant could be established. They're going to say, well, no. They overlap each other. They run together for about 40 years and then it ends. So they do a lot of that. There's a lot of examples of them where they'll just say, we're not going to use these passages. We'll use other passages. And if I don't have an answer to it, we'll see how they answer that in a minute. But basically, they just say, we can't know. But we'll see. They have a verse that they go to do that. But yes, that's a great point. So an example of spiritualizing, the above passage, they talk about Jesus' second coming in 70 A.D., Acts chapter 1, what did the angels say when they watched Jesus go into the clouds? He would return the same way. So from that, we can infer that he will be seen. Man will see them. As he was taken up, he will come down. If you ask any 70 AD teacher that is going to be honest, and most of them will, they'll say he was not seen. Max King will tell you, and he has answered in debates and in his book, he contends Jesus was not seen in the destruction of 70 AD. It was spiritual. And that's where we see that they spiritualize a lot of things. We'll see more examples of it, but that's probably a vivid one. He spiritually returned. And all of these things that we're talking about, including Acts chapter 1, were spiritual or figurative language. And back to your question the other day, Tara, when we go to Acts chapter 1, there's nothing figurative around it at all. It's literal people that are literally talking to physical Jesus who physically goes into the air, and physical angels go, as you saw him go, you will see him return. And they go, well, that's figurative there. We're going to jump to figurative. Again, kind of caricature. That's, I don't know a lot of people that do that exactly that way. This is one doctrine that does, though. That's that one way that they just jump back and forth between the two. That's a great question. If we have enough time at the end of the class, I hope to consider that, because some of their views are going to demand us ask the question, is there a purpose in communion? We'll come back to that, but I hope we'll be able to come back to that by the time we get through the rest of this. So let's look at a few key points. A few key points that comes up. So the resurrection, that's going to be a major one. They believe that the resurrection occurred in 70 AD. You think, how can you believe that? Spiritualize it. If you spiritualize it, it becomes a lot easier. So keep in mind, we're redefining terms such as resurrection. We're going to redefine that. We're going to make it figurative and spiritualize it. And so what they see is not a physical resurrection of a physical body, but instead a spiritual resurrection occurred in 70 AD. Specifically, what they're going to look at as the passages that we even taught, that we would look at and go that this great resurrection is coming, they're going to say, hey, that was the church. The church was resurrected. So, John chapter 5. Here's an example of this. John chapter 5, verses 28 through 29. Somebody want to read those verses?
Do not marvel at the little. The hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come forth. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation.
All right. So Jesus talks about this coming resurrection, something coming out of the grave, something that is resurrected to righteousness or is resurrected to evil. These are the things that we can see here. Either they are those who did good deeds to a resurrection of life, those who commit evil deeds, a resurrection of judgment. So, they're going to look at this passage and say that occurred, that happened in 70 AD. It happened with the church. That implies a few things. For something to be resurrected, what has to happen to it? What's going to happen to you before you're resurrected? You're going to die. We're going to have to be dead. So the church, one of the implications of their understanding of this, the church has to be dead in 70 AD. Matthew 16:18 comes to mind that Jesus said that won't happen. Gives Peter the keys to the kingdom. Upon this, the confession that he makes, Peter, upon this rock I give you the keys of the kingdom, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. That's not going to happen, and yet the implication by believing this resurrection that he just talked about is the church being resurrected. Specifically, what they'll say is the church was choked out. The church was being killed by Judaism. It was destroying it. And so Jesus came and conquered Judaism and resurrected the church back to life. But what else do we see? We saw 2 resurrections in that account. So by their understanding, the second implication is, one, not only was the church dead, but the church was resurrected, and you have a church of righteous, and you have a church of evil. You have 2 different churches now by this understanding that just doesn't make sense. And again, they'll kind of ignore those passages. That's figurative language, and not give very good answers to what that passage means. Let's look at another passage. Matthew chapter 22. Somebody wants to turn over and read that. Matthew 22, verses 23 through 32. And the context here of this passage is these Sadducees who said, there will not be a physical resurrection. Kind of interesting. There will not be a physical resurrection. They come to Jesus and say, okay, in the resurrection, this woman has she marries 7 brothers, and each one of them dies, and then she dies. And so whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Somebody wants to read 23 through 32.
Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. So too the second and third, down to the 7th. After them all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all have her. And Jesus answered, you all wrong. Because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. In the resurrection, they neither marry, neither marry nor are given in marriage. They're like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, you have not read what it was said to you by God. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard this, they were astonished at his speech.
So they're going to contend that that's a figurative spiritual resurrection that he's talking about. A little bit ironic to me and a little bit worrisome that a people who did not believe in a physical resurrection, Jesus' words to them were, "You are wrong." That feels like that should echo throughout time to today. But it doesn't, because we can say they were wrong because they didn't understand the type of resurrection that Jesus was talking about. Jesus was talking about a figurative spiritual resurrection. How do we know Jesus was talking about a physical resurrection just from this passage? He is not God of the dead, but of the living. So they say he's talking about the Spirit. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 talks about death. Talks about the silver cord being cut. And in our physical death, you remember what Ecclesiastes 12 says about the Spirit? Does the Spirit die to be resurrected later? Ecclesiastes 12 verses 6 through 7. Remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed, the pitcher by the well is shattered, and the wheel of the cistern is crushed. All of these different languages for a physical death. The dust, what our bodies are made of, the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the Spirit will return to God who gave it. Spirit doesn't die. The Spirit returns to God. So to say, well, he's talking about a spiritual resurrection. The Spirit hasn't died. When we die, the Spirit goes to God. We know this is talking about a physical resurrection. And yes, to Jerry, your point, he even goes as far to say, when I look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are physically dead, I see them alive because I am the God of the living. They are still alive in some way. Their spirit has went to God. So can that resurrection have any implication to the church in 70 AD being brought back to life? Even if we try to spiritualize it, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit the context of the passage. It doesn't fit what other Bible passages say about the Spirit. It doesn't fit what he's saying about God saying they're not dead. And also, they're not members of the church. Not even by the stretch of the imagination, well, they're members of the congregation of Israel. No, they're not. They're the fathers of the congregation of Israel. They're what that came out of, but they existed prior to that covenant. There's no context that we can take that and say this applies to some congregational group of God's people. The only thing we can read from this is Jesus talking about the physical resurrection of individuals at some point in the future. Yes, sir.
Just real quickly, I went to school with Maxine's son,
Oh, really?
and he was named after the football coach.
Yeah.
And we would have major Bible studies all the time. And one of the things that he just reminded me of, that he just couldn't deal with the son.
Yeah.
And I don't know if the father believed this or not, but Paul's writings talk about the resurrection. You look at 1 Corinthians 15, and it's all
Yeah.
over it. You know, he could not, now maybe his dad might have had a little something more going for it, but they couldn't answer it. There's so much in that describing specifics in verse 1 they couldn't have.
Yeah.
And when you look at the kingdom, it was interesting to me that when you read that book, he always used kingdom a lot in there. But when you look at what is truly the kingdom, it's the church. And the kingdom of God of Jesus will last forever. You know, there's so many, and I don't know, it just amazes me.
Yeah. Was that around Ohio? Was that where you went to school at?
No, I went to college at Harding.
Harding? Okay.
And he was,
Yeah. So I know that Max Max King is from, what was the church? It's in Ohio. The Brookwood Way Church of Christ in Mansfield, Ohio. That's where he was at when he started pushing this out. And it is spread. Ohio, there's a lot of places in Ohio that believe this. It's spread really heavily into Indiana. Indianapolis has several congregations that not only do they preach this, but it's kind of like their base of operation to go out into the world. And one thing you'll find is, as I said, they're happy to study with you. Probably but it's more of a debate than a study. They're very contentious about this. They're ready to fight. And what my experience has been, we're looking for a platform. If you'll let us come into your church and talk about this, you can try to refute us. We'll be happy to do that. But we just really want people to hear this. They're very, very focused on trying to spread this as much as they can. But to your point, there are several things that they just will either say, we're not going to talk about that. And that has been the experience of several people who engaged in them in debates. So that they just refuse to talk about certain passages. There's certain things we're not going to cover. Or if they are going to talk about them, they're going to talk about it in such a way as to try to, instead of answering the question, I'm going to try to slander the person that I'm speaking with. Or I'm going to try to take their credibility instead of looking at the passage and going, this is a meaning for that passage.
Like you said earlier, when they go down that spiritual route, spiritually hard, you cannot get there if you think
Yeah.
rapture when they go down that spiritual side.
Yeah. And this is part of the reason why we brought up Isaiah 5. When you become your own dictionary, when I'm the one that's going to set the definitions for the words that I use, and I'm the one that's going to tell people this is what this means, really what we see is something that occurred all the way back in Genesis 3. I'm going to be the judge of good and evil. I'm going to be the God of this matter. And when that occurs, it's really hard to break that, to get someone to see the dangers. Man, that was the first bell. Guys, what have I done? 1 Corinthians 15, they're going to look at that and they're going to say it's all about Judaism and Christianity. Everything that we see in there, all the language, it's just all is, he talks about a natural body and a spiritual body. Natural is Judaism, spiritual is the church. Perishable is Judaism, imperishable is the church. And so really what they're saying is Judaism died. We're not going to say the church died because Matthew 16, we can't say that. Judaism died, and what came out of it in 70 AD was Christianity. That doesn't fit at all what the Bible talks about in Acts chapter 2. The entire book of Acts is describing things that happened long before 70 AD, 33 AD, 45 AD, 55 AD. Things were happening, the kingdom being preached, the kingdom growing. Christianity to them is really more like a reformed Judaism by the ways they look at it. Jeremiah 31, which is quoted in Hebrews 8, a new covenant that I make with you that is not like the covenant of your fathers. Christianity is not Judaism. It's not even a polished up version of Judaism. It is something new. So in these verses, Paul describes, verses 3 through 4, he talks about Jesus' death, which is a physical, bodily death. Verse 20, he uses this agricultural term to say that Jesus is the first fruits, and that those who follow are going to be like the first fruits. What you plant the first time and what it produces, you expect that the second time. With the next crop, it's going to look the same thing. So if Jesus physically died, and this is probably the reason why they don't go to 1 Corinthians 15, and was physically resurrected, on which our entire hope is founded on, that's the whole point of 1 Corinthians 15, if that didn't happen, we are of all men most pitied. If that's what happened and he's the first fruits, that's what's going to happen to us. And they'll say, no, it's not. It's spiritual what's going to happen to us because it happened in 70 AD. Verses 23 through 28 also uses this word those, which is a plural personal pronoun. If he was talking about the church, he would say something like it or that which belongs to Christ. But he says those which belong to Christ. He's talking about individuals in that passage. So Judgment Day is another one. We're gonna jump through it really quickly. This word mellow in Acts 17:31 says that Christ will come. They take that word and say that that has to mean soon. And when you go to Blue Letter Bible or you get a concordance, a dictionary, and you look up the Greek word mello, which is translated will, one of the views is soon. And so, again, pigeonholing, they'll take that and say it always must mean soon because we want it to mean soon in this place, so it must mean soon in every place. Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 through 6, he uses the same word, but in the Hebrew sense. I am going to send, or he will come. He's talking about Elijah. Who was that fulfilled in? I said his name on accident. John the Baptist. Now, was that soon? Malachi happened in 450 BC. This is 400 years later. Now, when they see soon, they're going to say that has to be in the days of that generation for it to be soon. If it's not in the days of that generation, it's not soon. Well, God said in Malachi 4, I am soon going to send, and they're using their own language, I'm soon going to send Elijah. It was 400 years later. Romans chapter 5, verse 14, he talks about this new Adam who was to come. That's the same word, mello. Now, he's going all the way back to the creation, talking about Adam who was to come from creation. We're talking about several thousands of years. We're still going to use their word soon. In God's eyes, soon might be a couple days. I think 2 Peter chapter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3 talks about with God a day is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years is like a day. That's another thing that we go to see that we're not talking about. When we talk about figurative and literal and understanding the difference, the Bible will tell us when we're going to shift. Peter is talking about a literal day of judgment that is coming in 2 Peter chapter 3. But then when he gets to this phrase, he's going to jump from literal to figurative, and he's going to use the word like. To say, hey, guess what? I'm about to make a comparison that is not one-to-one. It is not the exact same thing. So the Bible tells us when we're getting ready to shift to figurative language. That's what we were talking about right there. This end of the world, they're going to look at that. This is a quote from Max King. The world marked for destruction and prophecy, the end of which involved the second coming of Christ and resulted in the true redemption of Israel, was the Jewish world. So in 2 Peter chapter 3, when we talk about the world being burned up and destroyed, we're talking about Judaism. Therefore, it is the end of the Jewish world and not this material world on which we live. But if you compare verses 5 and 6, verse 5 and 6 says God has done this before with Noah. They'll say that's literal. That literally happened. Verses 7 and 10, but this world is going to be destroyed with fire, going to be burned up with all of its elements. That's figurative. That's why we need to make sure we understand when to jump from literal to figurative. So, to the questions, do we still need to take the Lord's 1 Corinthians 11:26, Paul says, you do this until Christ comes. So, do we need to do this? They're split, half and half. Some will say, no, we don't. Others will say, we still do because it teaches us an important lesson about what Christ did. Do we need to be baptized? Is there any reason to be baptized if the spiritual coming of Christ has occurred? What is the point of baptism? They're going to say, we're split 50-50. Some of us think you still need to be baptized because it teaches a lesson about what Jesus did. Others will say, no, because Hebrews chapter 9, verse 10. When things were reformed, when Judaism was reformed, the regulations were put to an end. And this is what has happened with Christ. The new heaven and the new earth is here. And so there's no need to be baptized anymore. So there's heavy implications. This affects all aspects of Scripture. There's never going to be an end of this world filled with suffering. Someone who is suffering that's looking forward to the coming of Christ, that this finally will end for me, they're going to say, there's no hope in that. The world never ends. Well, what's going to happen? Deuteronomy 29. That belongs to God. Guys, I went over, but I thank you all so much for giving me the time to cover those things, and I know we just did it very quickly. John will be back, should be back on Wednesday, and on your syllabus, page 1, you will see we are going to look at, I believe, the Antichrist on that date. So, thank you guys. I'm sorry, not the Antichrist.